Good evening and welcome into our Bible study tonight. I hope you're having a good day around your house. We've had a really great day here at Eastside. We've worshiped God this morning and we're able to gather here in the building to do that. We're coming to you just online tonight with a lesson that we hope will be really beneficial to you and help you be a better servant of Jesus Christ and of your fellow man. I want to start tonight with a question. If you knew that you had less than 24 hours to live, what would you do? What would be on your list of things that you'd want to get done before you pass from this life? Maybe you'd want to fulfill an item on your bucket list, or maybe more than one, things that you haven't done yet that you always wanted to get around to. Maybe you'd go spend all your money on others or yourself, or maybe you'd just get out and drive a car as fast as it would go because you've never been able to do that. Maybe you'd seek some thrill or pleasure that you never have. Maybe you would go off your diet and eat everything you wanted to. After all, if you're going to be dead in 24 hours, your cholesterol level doesn't matter much. It's said of Socrates that when he was about to be put to death, toward the end of his life, he was in confinement, and he heard somebody outside, a minstrel, singing a song that he never had heard before, and he asked for that minstrel to be brought in and teach him that song. And one of his friends asked him, why would you want to spend your last hours learning a new song? And Socrates' answer was, well, I want to just learn one more thing before I die. And so maybe if you've been interested in learning and finding out everything you can know in life, maybe you'd want to learn one more thing before you die. But I expect if most of us knew that we had 24 hours to live, we would either focus on having some experience that we never had before, doing something that would bring us pleasure or joy to some degree, or we would spend time with loved ones and maybe say things to them that we wanted them to remember, and have some time with those who are closest to us. Probably most of us wouldn't think about doing something to serve others, some menial task that would be of benefit to others. And so it's fascinating to me as we open our Bibles to John chapter 13 tonight and look at one of the things that Jesus did in the few hours that he had with his disciples on the night that he was betrayed, the day before his crucifixion. He spends time doing the most menial task you can think of, washing their feet, going around with a towel and a basin of water and washing his disciples' feet. We'll talk more about that precise action and what was involved in it, what it signified as we go through the story. But I want to pick up and just look at this with you tonight and examine Jesus' motivations, the kind of service that he was willing to do, and the significance of all of this for those of us who call ourselves his disciples even today. We're talking about serving like the master, and we begin then in John 13 and verse 1. It says, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come and that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus knew that he would depart. He knew that, but he also knew how he felt about his disciples. It says that he loved them to the end. The end here might mean the last moment of his life, or it could mean to the furthest extent of loving. In other words, in fact, I think one translation says he loved them to the uttermost. Either one of those, and maybe both of them, is what John intends for us to understand when he says that Jesus loved them to the end. To the very last moment of his life, but also to the furthest extent, the greatest degree that anybody could love anybody. Jesus loved his disciples. Our service to others and Jesus' service to his disciples was a reflection of his love. And that's where we want to start tonight. His motivation for service was love. He loved them to the end. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13, The Apostle Paul says, through love, serve one another. It is out of love, out of a concern for the well-being of others, that we want to serve them. We want to do for them what will be most beneficial to them, whatever it might be. That's the true motivation of love that demonstrates itself in service. If you love someone, you're not concerned so much about whether or not they make you happy. You're concerned much more about their well-being and doing anything that you can do to improve their well-being and to help them. Jesus was everlastingly concerned about the well-being of his disciples and about our well-being even today. And that's going to motivate his actions on this occasion. Our service of others and to others is a reflection of our love for them, but also of our love for God. There's a passage I want us to look at quite carefully here for just the next minute or so in the book of Hebrews, chapter 6 and verse 10. It says that our God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love which you have shown toward his name, in that you've ministered to the saints and do minister. We need to break down this passage really carefully. The Hebrew writer is encouraging those to whom he's writing, Jewish Christians, telling them that God's going to remember the service that they've done for his name. That's what he says at first. God will not forget your work and labor of love which you've done toward his name, for him. But he goes on and explains how that love was accomplished, or how that love was demonstrated. In that you have ministered to the saints. The English Standard Version says, God is not unjust to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints, as you still do. Here's something, and we can preach on this, and look at Bible passages, and yet somehow we fail to make this connection. We love God by loving each other. We love God when we serve him, and we serve him when we serve others. The very first lesson I preached at Eastside when I came here 10 years ago, nearly, was a lesson on love that made exactly this point, that we love God by loving others. We love God by loving others. And we serve God then by serving others. If you want to show that you love God, find someone who's made in the image of God to serve. That's what Jesus is showing his disciples. That's where his motivation is coming from. He loves God, and so he loves God's creation. He loves God's children, and he serves them. He's showing us that important connection. We've talked during this time of the pandemic that loving God at its greatest extent is serving others. We're trying during this difficult time to make sure that we're concerned about the well-being of especially our brothers and sisters in Christ, and showing them love, whatever that takes, whatever sacrifice is involved in that. And in doing that, we are loving God by the very Bible description of what loving God really is. Notice again the verse and what it says. God will remember your labor of love which you've shown toward his name, in that you serve the saints. We need to have that indelibly imprinted on our minds and in our hearts. Jesus knew it. He showed love for others. He loved God, and those two were connected because he had, after all, an eternal relationship with the Father. Later on in the Gospel of John, in John 17, he'll talk about the love that he had for God and that God had for him before time began. Jesus was and is in an eternal Father-Son loving relationship with his Father in heaven. Notice back in chapter 13 then, and the last part of verse 1, Jesus knew that he would depart from the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own then that were in the world, he loved them to the end. He had this relationship with the Father that was on his mind, that he was fully aware of. He knew that he was in this relationship with the Father. In John 16 and verse 28, he says, I came forth from the Father and have come into the world. Again, I leave the world and go to the Father. He knew where he'd come from. He knew where he was going. Of course, we didn't come from heaven. God created us, as we talked about this morning, in the womb of our mothers. He knitted us together there. But we, if we're his children today, ought to know where we're going. And we ought to be in this very similar relationship with God the Father. When we know we are the children of God, and that we will be in the presence of God forever when we leave this earth, it will affect the way we live right up to the end. Right up to the end. And it certainly affected Jesus on this occasion. So his love for others was his motivation. His relationship with the Father was part of that motivation as well. And those are our motivations today for service, just as they were his on this occasion. Continuing on, let's look at the nature of the service of Jesus. We'll continue the text in verse 2. Supper being ended, the devil already having put it in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Simon said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus' service was humble and it was menial. The roads in Judea at the time Jesus lived certainly were not paved roads as we know today. They were dusty, and if it rained, they were muddy. The roads would just almost turn to liquid slush. So it was the custom of a host in any home to provide a servant at the door to wash the feet of any dinner guests that would come in. The servant would, as Jesus would do on this occasion, kneel with a bucket of water and a towel to scrub the gunk off of the feet of the guest. If a home could not afford a slave or a servant to do this, it usually fell to the youngest child in the house, or maybe even a friend or a guest who'd come early would be willing to do this for the host. In doing this work that Jesus is about to do there in John 13, then, he's taking the job of, in essence, the lowest person in the household, whether it have been a slave or a young child or whatever, and washing his disciples' feet. Apostle Peter understands, as all of them do, that this was somewhat out of position for one who was their master and Lord. Jesus was truly humbling himself, and humbling himself to do something, as we said, that was a very, very menial task. What's more interesting as you go through the story is that none of the other disciples had done this. None of the others. Again, this was a custom. And as I said, oftentimes the first person who came as a guest to a feast or a meal or something like that, they would take on this responsibility, especially if they were friends. But none of the disciples had offered to do this. They'd all sat there with gunk on their feet, so to speak, with unwashed feet, apparently. Jesus is the one who takes the towel and the water and washes their feet. It was just a few days before this, the Gospel of Mark tells us in Mark chapter 10 and verse 35, that Jesus' disciples had been taught this lesson by Jesus, but apparently it didn't catch on. Jesus had spent some good amount of time in John chapter 10. The issue had arisen when in John 10 and verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, Mark 10 and verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Grant us that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on the left in your glory. So here James and John, and they want these elevated positions with Jesus, on one on the right hand and one on the left, when you sit on your throne in your kingdom, basically, is what they're asking for. That's not asking much, right? They just want to be second most important in all the kingdom, above all of the other disciples. Well, when the 10 heard it in verse 41 of Mark 10, when the 10 heard it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John. But Jesus called them to himself and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to be great among you shall be your servant. And whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The Son of Man did not come to serve, but to be served. To be served, rather, but to serve, and to give his life. Jesus himself came from heaven to serve. Here's the lesson that he taught his apostles just a few days before, not very long at all, before the events of John 13. It hadn't made a dent, apparently. It had gone over the top of them like water off a duck's back. They had either no concept of it or no intention of applying what Jesus had clearly taught them in the text in Mark chapter 10. And so here in John 13, the room, as one commentator said, the room was filled with proud hearts and dirty feet, because the disciples had not learned this lesson of humility. The disciples were willing to fight for a throne, but not for a towel. That's the nature of the men that we're looking at here. And Jesus, no doubt, is distressed about this. He needs them to be servants. He needs them to learn to serve one another. In fact, he needs them to learn to serve all of mankind and to put everybody else before themselves, because he would love them and he wanted his disciples to love the world as he did. No act of love was too menial or too low for Jesus. Just think about it. Within 24 hours of the events of John 13, he's going to be giving his life on a cross. The most humiliating, excruciating way of dying that perhaps has ever been conceived. And Jesus will willingly submit to that for you and for me and for these disciples. He understood what it took to serve. Dave Thomas, the late Dave Thomas, was the founder of the Wendy's fast food chain. One time he appeared on the cover of the company's annual report, dressed in a work apron and holding a mop and a plastic bucket. He described that picture as, "I got my MBA long before I got my GED." At Wendy's, the MBA does not mean Master of Business Administration. It means mop bucket attitude. And that's the attitude he had. And beyond that, of course, that's the attitude Jesus had. He was, as one author put it, the God of the towel. Here he is, coming from glory, coming from heaven itself, to take a towel and wash his disciples' feet, to die on a cross and save us from our sins. What an extraordinary attitude of humility. Philippians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul will describe Jesus as one who emptied himself. He humbled himself and took the form of a servant, as he was found in fashion as a man. When we go on with the text, we note that Peter refuses. We'd read in John 13 and verse 5 that Jesus had poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. He comes to Simon Peter in verse 6. Peter said to him, "Lord, are you washing my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, and not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus says, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." So Peter didn't want Jesus to wash his feet. There are several things going on in this dialogue between Jesus and Peter, but one of the things that's clear is Peter knew that it was not the master's responsibility, or he thought he knew, that it was not the master's responsibility to wash his feet, the servant's feet. Again, washing the feet was the responsibility of the lowest of slaves. So this was unheard of, that one who'd been called Lord and Master, who Peter himself had confessed to be the very Son of God, that one who had that sort of authority and position would wash his feet. Jesus was their master. He was the Christ, the Son of the living God, as Peter had confessed. If anything, obviously, they should be washing his feet. So Peter at first refuses this act from Jesus. Yet Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me. What does he mean by that? Well, if we can't accept service from Jesus, we can't accept him. We can't accept his grace. If you can't accept the fact that Jesus humbled himself and came in fashion as a man and died on a cross for you, serving you in the most inglorious way that can be imagined, so that you could have your sins forgiven. If you can't accept that service from the King of Kings, then you have no part with him. You have to allow him to do that for you, so to speak. You have to admit that you needed it and just be grateful that he did. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. It is in giving his life that he showed us the fullest meaning of service. If you can't accept the service of God's Son, you cannot be saved. And so when Jesus says here, if you don't let me do this, you have no part with me, that's the point I believe that he's getting to. Peter, you've got to let me serve you. You've got to let me serve you. And if you can't let me serve you, we can't have a relationship. I can't help you if you won't let me serve you. Jesus' death was nothing short of heaven emptying itself for earth. Jesus emptied himself to do what he did. If we can accept service from Jesus, we can and should be willing also to accept it from anyone. That's a maybe unspoken lesson in this particular story, but I think it's important. When someone wants to serve you out of love, out of goodness, for your benefit, it's important that you let them do that and be humble enough. Peter's problem, he had several, but he obviously at times thought he knew more than the master did. That comes out multiple times. He was impetuous and at times somewhat proud, although he strove for humility, as a lot of us do. Yet the pride comes out, doesn't it? Peter was having trouble accepting Jesus, serving him. We need to have the true humility to let Jesus and others serve us. I'm thinking about a text in the book of Acts, Acts 16, where the Apostle Paul is in the city of Philippi. And he's come there, and apparently there's not a synagogue there, so they go down to the river, Paul and his companions, and there are some women there, apparently worshiping. And the text says in Acts 16 and verse 14, a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira who worshipped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. Here's a woman, a newly minted Christian. She'd just been baptized for the remission of her sins. She just had her sins washed away in the blood of Christ. She'd received the service of Jesus and his love, and now she wanted to show his love and serve others immediately. And so she insists, she persuades, she begs and persuades Paul and his companions to come and stay at her house and receive her hospitality. And again, that's the very attitude Jesus is demonstrating back in John 13. He's saying to Peter, you've got to let me serve you. He's not forcing him to do it, but he's just saying, you need to let me serve you. Lydia saying to Paul, you need to let me serve you. There are people in your life today who are saying, let me serve you. Let's have the humility to do that. There has been, over the years, I think, sort of a false humility where people who could use help, and maybe they didn't really need help, but somebody wants to serve you or do something for you, let them do it. Let them do it, especially if they're doing it out of the motivation of love and concern for your well-being. That's such an important thing to understand. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9, Peter says, be hospitable to one another. You see that? In order for that to happen, not only do we have to have people showing hospitality, we have to have people willing to be given hospitality, to take the hospitality that's being shown. Be hospitable to one another. As each has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So we serve and we allow ourselves to be served. It may take as much humility to serve as it does to let another serve you, and vice versa. Peter, it seems to me, never forgot this image and this lesson. In years forward, I believe Peter really came to understand what it meant to be a servant of others. And in his wonderful first epistle, 1 Peter, and in chapter 5 and verse 5, he writes these words, yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Peter understood the importance of grace. He admonishes us to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Have to be humble to accept grace. Have to be humble to be submissive. Someone has said that we may easily be too big for God to use, but we will never be too small for Him to use. Let God use you. Be a servant. Allow yourself to be served. Those are some of the lessons that Jesus is trying to teach His disciples and us in John chapter 13. So let's go back to that text. A disciple, a Christian, is a servant. In John 13, now verses 14 and 15, starting verse 13 really, he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Every follower of Christ must become a servant. Jesus is revealing that servanthood is in fact the responsibility and duty of all who would follow Him. Because He was a servant, if we follow Him, we must be servants too. If I, your Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you must wash one another's feet. I've given you an example. The very idea of being a Christian is to be Christ-like. A disciple is a follower of the Master. Both the word disciple and Christian suggest to us the imitation of Christ. Now, does this mean that foot washing is supposed to be a church ordinance today and that we're literally supposed to be going around washing one another's feet? Well, if that would be a service to them, that would be fine. But in our modern age, where most everybody takes a bath every day and wears shoes and socks, when we walk on sidewalks and on linoleum in our houses, and it's not necessary to wash feet. But whatever it takes to serve is the point. It's all about service. I want to notice with you in John 13 and verse 17, we'll get back to this text in just a minute, but Jesus tells them at the end of this, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. The them there, that can't be washing feet. He's talking about lots of other things besides washing feet, isn't he? The washing feet is just a metaphor for service. A lot of people look at this and they say, oh, well, it's the literal washing of the feet that's important. No, the washing of the feet is just representative of the things and the them that we're supposed to be doing. And Jesus used language that plainly indicates that. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Not washing feet, but 1,000 things, maybe including washing feet and many other things that you can do to serve another person. The Son of Man, as we've said now this third time, did not come to be served, but to serve. He left an example to be followed. Luke's record of Jesus' discussion with the disciples on this night includes these words, Luke chapter 22 and verse 25. He said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as one who serves." Jesus is trying to teach them and us the true nature of both greatness and service, of humility and grace. I have a question for you. What do you call a boomerang that doesn't work? Well, you call it a stick, because if you throw it and it doesn't come back to you, it's just a stick. Next question. What do you call a Christian that isn't serving? Well, you could call him a stick, but he's not a Christian. That's for sure. Because Christians serve. Christians serve. And a boomerang that doesn't come back to you and a Christian that doesn't serve have quite a bit in common. They're both sticks. We need to be servants if we're followers of Christ. It's as simple as that. That last verse in this text, John 13 and verse 17, in the King James Version it says, "If you know these things, happy are you if you do them." The religion of Jesus Christ is a religion of doing. It's not just a religion of knowing. I think there are those who are Christians who think that because they know so much about the Bible, that they're, in that by itself, completely pleasing to the Lord. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need to know it. We need to know His Word. But unless we do it, it means nothing. It means nothing. Let's hear the Word and be doers of the Word, as James admonishes us in James chapter 1. I read a story sometime back about lightning striking an old shed on a farm, and the farmer was actually glad that it happened. Lightning struck the shed and burned it to the ground and just basically wiped it off the face of the earth. And the farmer was happy because he'd been meaning to tear down the shed anyway. And besides that, the rain from the storm washed his car that hadn't been washed in months, and so he had a clean car and a shed that had been torn down by the storm. And somebody asked him what he was going to do next, and he said, "Well, I'm waiting for an earthquake to shake the potatoes out of the ground, so that'll be taken care of as well." I think a lot of times we're like that. We just expect things, to happen, and it's just going to happen for us. We don't have to do anything to make it happen. Jesus is saying, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. The blessing comes in the doing. We can't just sit around and wait for happiness to drop from the sky or to hit us like a bolt of lightning. You want to be happy? I want to tell you what, we've had some really sad and sorrowful and stressful times in 2020. When do you want to be happy? You want to be happy now? You want to be happy in 2021? When and how are you going to be happy? You start doing what Jesus says. That's true of every last one of us. If you know these things, blessed are you, happy are you, if you do them. We can't serve from a distance. We need to be socially distanced, perhaps. But we need to serve one another personally. Understand what we need, even in a time like this, and be selfless enough to get our hands dirty, to get down on our knees if that's what it takes, to wash feet, to do whatever needs doing for the love of one another and the God who made us. If we're going to serve like Christ served, then we must learn to see others as He sees them. Jesus tells us that if we do these things, we'll be blessed, we'll be happy. In the final analysis, happiness comes from doing the things that a servant does, of all things. Happiness comes from doing the things that a servant does, putting others first, and following the example of Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for your time and interest in our Bible study. We hope that these words in this great account, this poignant account in John 13, have helped you and will help you be a better servant and be blessed. If you're not familiar with us at the Eastside Church of Christ, we invite you to visit our website, eastside-church.org, eastside-church.org. And there you can find out a lot of information about the congregation. If you're interested in getting in contact with some of us, my email address is there, along with the email addresses of the elders. Those are on the website if you want to reach out to us. A lot of good Bible information, Bible studies, Bible classes, sermons, all sorts of material available there on our website. We invite you to visit there and visit us here at Eastside. We meet at 110 French Way here in Athens, Alabama. If you're in our area, we meet at 7 o'clock on Wednesday nights now, live in the building, and also 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We'd love for you to come and be with us. May God bless you and have a great evening.